Hi there, this is Dave Brown, here to talk about the basics of infrared thermography, otherwise known as thermal imaging. Before we get to the actual demo, let's talk a little bit about a couple of science concepts that we probably haven't thought about since high school physics class. First of all, let's talk about the electromagnetic spectrum. We tend to think of electromagnetic waves mostly in terms of what we can see, in other words, the visible portion of the spectrum. But what we perceive as billions of colors is actually just a tiny sliver of the overall electromagnetic spectrum, which is made up of X-rays to gamma rays, radio waves, microwaves, and everything in between. On one side of the visible spectrum, we have ultraviolet radiation, and on the other, we have infrared. We perceive infrared radiation as being radiant heat energy, and that's the form of energy that this camera is designed to detect and measure. One of the things that's most important for a thermographer to understand about the electromagnetic spectrum is that a property of one material in one part of the electromagnetic spectrum might have little or nothing to do with the properties of that same material in another part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Take glass, for instance. We think of glass as being 100% or nearly 100% transparent. We can see everything right through it. However, in the infrared spectrum, glass is completely opaque. So that's important, obviously, for a thermographer to understand. Now let's review thermal dynamics. We usually think of heat as transferring in one of two ways. Conduction is the movement of heat through or between two different solid materials. Convection is the movement of heat from that solid material to a gas or liquid adjacent to it, or vice versa. So the most obvious example of that would be boiling an egg in water. The most common form of heat transfer in our world, however, is radiation. That's the form of heat that we feel in our hands next to a campfire. Now, I grew up thinking that that campfire was transmitting its heat through the air, but that's not in fact what happens. If we had a way of building a fire, even in a vacuum, we would still get that heat radiating off of it because of radiant heat transferring through a vacuum. And that's how the Earth gets its heat from the sun. It's this radiant energy that is detected and measured by the infrared camera that we're going to be looking at shortly. The use cases for infrared thermography are pretty much boundless. In industrial applications, we can easily spot hotspots in mechanical and electrical components to determine points of failure. We can easily detect body heat against a cold night background, making security a perfect use case for infrared thermography. You may have spotted those infrared cameras at the airport looking for facial heat and looking for elevated temperatures that might indicate presence of a fever in a crowd. Infrared thermography is a great way to spot missing insulation or HVAC problems, making it a great residential tool. And of course, infrared thermography is used in research and development and many other applications. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and do the demo. The camera we're going to be using for today's demo is the Model T300 by FLIR. We don't have time today to talk about all of the components of the camera, but we are going to talk about two, starting with the lens. This is made of a very interesting material called germanium, which in and of itself could easily constitute an entire discussion, but we're going to keep it simple. Suffice it to say, this material is a compelling example of what we were talking about earlier with the electromagnetic spectrum. To our eyes, it appears to be a metal, completely opaque in the visible spectrum. However, in the infrared, when treated properly, it's nearly 100% transparent, allowing that radiant energy to come through and hit the detector behind it. And then on the back, of course, We have our touchscreen display, which shows what the camera image is seeing, and a number of tools we can access for measurement purposes and so on. I'm going to set this camera up next to me on the tripod, and we'll get started with the demo. Due to space limitations, I've had to move the camera off frame, but I've connected it to my PC and shared with you the application that will allow us to see the live image in real time. First thing I want to demonstrate is simply what it looks like when I put my hand in the frame of the camera. You can see very clearly the differences in temperature from the warmer to the colder parts of my hand, even to the point where if you look carefully, you can see the veins where the colder blood is returning to my heart. The other interesting thing about the sensitivity of this camera is even when I take my hand away, you can see that the material of the surface that it was placed on still shows the heat from where the camera was. Now, there are all kinds of fun things we could do with this camera. We could analyze the efficiency of my travel mug and talk about the reflectivity of stainless steel. We could draw secret messages in ice to each other. I was going to put an H there, but the ice slipped out of my hand. But let's stick with some of the more serious topics. You've no doubt noticed that the camera is constantly recalibrating itself and trying to give us the optimal image for the temperatures that are showing on the image, which is why we're able to capture an image with full radiometric data. So for instance, earlier, I took an image of my hand, and we can see even after that image has been captured, I can add spots to the image to find the hottest spots on the image, the coolest spots. The temperatures are displayed over here on the right. I could even set an area in which I can see the hottest temperature, the lowest temperature, and the average temperature across that entire area. So that makes this much more effective as a thermographic tool. For the final part of our demo today, we just want to circle back to that discussion of the electromagnetic spectrum and how the properties of one material in one part of the spectrum can be very different than the properties in another. We talked about glass earlier. You can see my glasses are made of glass, and of course they're completely transparent in the visible spectrum. However, when I put them in front of the infrared camera, you can see that they are completely opaque. You cannot see my fingers through them at all. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have polyethylene, which we think of as trash bags. Again, in the visible spectrum, it's completely opaque. You cannot see my hand through it at all. However, if I move my hand to in front of the infrared camera, you can see that the material is completely transparent. And you can also see where it's getting very bright, where my hand is actually touching the material and changing the surface temperature of the material. This is actually how the police were able to find the Boston Marathon bomber years ago under the polyethylene tarp on the boat in Watertown. I hope you found this demo interesting, enjoyable. I thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up.